So welcome to the Boston Society of Architects lecture series at the Boston Public Library. And thank you for coming today. Before I introduce our notable speaker, please turn off your cell phones. I am Nazneen Cooper, and I am Associate AIA and Assistant Dean of Campus Design and Planning at Harvard University for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and I am your host tonight. Tonight's event is very special. It is part of the 31st year of the BSA's lecture series, and this talk is also the keynote event for a program called Architects and Artists Collaborate, sponsored by BSA's Membership Enrichment Committee. The program is a month-long celebration of the unique relationship between architecture and art. It offers guided artist studio visits, tonight's lecture, a tour of public art at MIT, as well as a series of open studio crawls throughout the metropolitan area. For more information about the program, contact the Boston Society of Architects or visit the website architects.org. On this website, you will also be able to access several other very interesting programs happening at the BSA, which are open to the public. Tonight, we're honored to welcome James Wines. James Wines is the founder and president of SITE, an internationally known architecture and environmental arts organization chartered in New York City in 1970. He is also a professor of architecture at Penn State University. His creative work over the past decade has been focused on green buildings and public spaces. Professor Wines is the former chair of environmental design at Parsons School of Design, where he started a graduate program in architecture and architectural criticism. He has delivered lectures at more than 800 colleges, universities, and professional conferences in 47 countries. He has published numerous books and essays in the US, Europe, and Asia, and since 1975, there have been 22 monographs and museum catalogs produced on projects for SITE and their related models and drawings. Professor Wines has designed and built in excess of 150 architecture, landscape, public space, environmental art, interior, and exhibition projects for private and municipal clients. That's a hefty body of work. Winner of 25 art, writing, and design awards, including the 1995 Chrysler Award for Design Innovation, James Wines is also the recipient of fellowships and grants from the National Endowment of Arts for the Arts, the Crest Foundation, the American Academy in Rome, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Graham Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Pulitzer Prize Organization. Professor Wines' drawings have been exhibited at 125 different museums and galleries in 12 countries. Some of these include the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Venice Biennale, the Whitney Museum in New York, the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Australian National Gallery in Sydney, the Louvre in Paris, the Max Protech Gallery in New York, the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., and a 2004 retrospective in France at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Orleans. His drawings are also in many public and private collections. Mr. Wines lives and works in New York City, with frequent travels abroad for projects and lectures. He is a tireless advocate for excellent design, and tonight he has agreed to bring us back around to its fundamentals. His lecture is called A Line Around an Idea, and it explores the continued relevance of hand drawing in the digital age. Please welcome James Wines.
Okay, thank you, really. Thanks a lot for inviting me to. I'm really honored. This is a very nice event, and I've been aware of it, these lectures going on for a long time. I don't live in the city, but I'm certainly aware of what the society, Boston Society of Architects does, and it's really commendable. Thanks a million. Anyway, tonight I'm going to talk about a subject sort of close to my heart, but it's interesting because I also teach as well as practice, but I'm just so aware that students are, you look at a screen all day and then you look at a screen all night, and finally you kind of don't want to look at a screen anymore. And quite a few young people seem to be discovering the human hand again, you know, like sketching and drawing. And it's so kind of fundamental to you know, what we're trying to do, and I do it very rapidly, so I was getting very impatient while somebody, you know, sort of downloads and gets the software ready and everything, and hours later they come up with something where, you know, you can have 50 sketches done in the same amount of time. So what I wanted to talk about tonight, it's kind of funny in the computer age, because actually our firm, I mean, people think I'm going to, you know, downgrade computers, or I'm anti-computer. To the contrary, our firm was one of the first. We're in the very early 80s. We computerized pretty quickly because we were working abroad, and we realized that we would need, you know, this communication. I mean, it was a very practical thing to do. And I've never regarded it as anything but a great tool. It's another one of those tools. I know that some people get really obsessed by it, and so their whole world becomes locked on the desktop here. But I've always thought of it just like another way of adding to your workforce and your work capabilities. But what did happen, and certainly in the academic world, I think you're all pretty aware, is that, you know, these seeds of computers and all these people, just these little robots, it's like a prosthetic extension of their bodies, and they're just going on all day. And so much of the decision making is sort of dependent on what the digital world provides. So in other words, you're sort of programmed by what the computers want you to be programmed by. You can program it, but it programs you. So I want to talk tonight about it just to kind of loosen up this whole subject and talk about this issue of a line around idea. And let me see if I can get this thing operating here. Maybe we can turn the house lights down a little bit so we can get going here. All right, let's see if this lights up. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that? Looks good? None of my preferred networks are available. I always hate these endless messages. God, it's just like unbelievable. You know, God. Well, they discovered my age. I get about 50 Viagra ads a day now. I mean, they really know who they're talking to here. I'm post-Viagra, I think. I mean, my period. But anyway, okay, they found me. But this whole issue of drawing, I mean, I'm a great admirer, of course, of Einstein, as everybody is, but it was interesting how he drew constantly. He was always drawing, really, and he said, when I examine myself and my methods of thought, I come to the conclusion that my gift of fantasy has meant more to me than my talent for absorbing positive knowledge. And it seems that's the bottom line. One thing with this sort of mind-to-hand connection is it really gives you something very tactile to work with. I know a number of writers who prefer to do their first manuscript by writing it by hand, and then converting it to computer as they're sort of refining it. And I do very much the same thing with drawing, and I think a lot of people do, certainly in my generation. It's where we've had to sort of bridge between these two. Anyway, the quote came from Matisse himself. Drawing is putting a line around an idea, and I thought it's a great way of summing it up. And it's funny how, and I talk to students, and as I do a lot, and even mature architects, or, you know, you show these two pictures, say, well, which one of these artists could draw well? And 90% of them will point to the Ang drawing. Oh, well, that's a nice drawing because it's accurate and it looks like a woman sitting holding an apple and everything. And they tend to not like the Matisse drawing. And I tell them, well, they're equally good. They're just two different things. They're two different ideas being developed in front of you. And it's really hard to explain that, why something that doesn't seem to be accurate or doesn't seem to be, it's something about something else, and that confusion has really been interested me, because I realize it's something very valuable between the brain and the hand and the style and the selection of form and idea, and everything has been kind of lost in the fray here. And so I'm going to talk a lot of different things tonight. Among them, the origins of drawing. I mean, all the uses of drawing. I mean, we wouldn't have graffiti if somebody hadn't drawn in the sand 20, 30,000 years ago. I mean, Warhol is an interesting kind of abstraction from drawing. In other words, in order to escape from drawing, you use processes to go back to drawing. I mean, there's so many artists and of theater in all walks of life. Robert Wilson, Einstein on the Beach, he draws beautifully. His drawings are in museums. So again, he's doing theater works, but they're in fact drawn. Then there's the body drawing, there's body drawing, there's the suicide girls. Yeah, unfortunately, when I was young, these girls didn't exist, because this is the kind of girl I'd love to take home to mother, this is, anyway, I was kind of rebellious at that time, but unfortunately the suicide girls are only recent. But they're into tattoos, they're into drawing on their own bodies. And then you have what we classically know as great drawing. We have Da Vinci, and we have this whole other area which we consider drawing, or high drawing. I like these two statements, because they're both by writers. The art of drawing is more real importance in the human race than that of writing. It should be taught to every child as writing is. We should talk less and draw more. Personally, I would like to renounce speech altogether, and like organic nature, communicating everything I have to say in sketches. And it's interesting how that idea has been nurtured in recent years. Even Derrida, and talking about in his later years about deconstruction, said that he thought that oral language was more reliable, because he was always trying to prove that not only was surface structure unreliable, but deep structure was unreliable as well. And so he was, oratory and spoken language, and the shamans that we don't have anymore who would carry the culture by the spoken word. Because the body language is as much a part of the meaning as everything else. So there's this other tactile, audio things that go into drawing. So it's a really important thing. The one thing I find, especially when teaching, I start saying, well, yeah, you people have got to learn how to draw. And almost half the class said, well, I know how to draw. I've been drawing since I was a kid. And they couldn't be more wrong. I mean, they draw terribly. And one of the reasons is that, most of them in high school or somewhere along the way, one of their parents gave them how to draw books. And these are really the fast food of the drawing world. They are absolute shit. They really are. I mean, not only do they not teach drawing, but the people who write the books don't know how to draw. I mean, this is just unbelievable. And then they immediately, as soon as they get into, by they're 14, they're proficient in computers. So you got the other flip side where everything looks good. And I remember when computers first started, we started using them in our office, I was just dazzled by all this, ability to sort of realistically render things, and it looked great to me. But now that my eyes are trained, I can be 50 feet from the monitor and detect crap instantly. My eyes are well trained now, so it's not the same. But anyway, this fast food thing has really, unfortunately, dominated our culture. People think they can draw. And it really is exactly like a McDonald's, bag of, chips there. And then you have this is real drawing. I mean, you have Rembrandt. The gap between something like this and something like this is like as far as you could be. But it's very, very difficult, I found now, to explain why is this great drawing? What is it about this that takes it to that transcendental level? Well, so this is kind of what I'm talking about today. The most aesthetically productive mind-to-hand drawing processes, as they contribute to the conceptual thinking in the arts, are based on calligraphic content, deep structure signification, media choices, and subliminal accidents. These elements function as the underlying fingerprints of creativity, which then become inseparable from the idea being described. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm just going to go through all the variations of that tonight. Conceptual thinking, calligraphic content, language development. I mean, it started, 25,000 years ago. I mean, you see these Lascaux and Paleolithic cave paintings, and you really realize, in fact, I think Picasso went to Altamira the first time and he started crying. He said, my God, they did it. They knew everything 25,000 years ago. And it was obviously, these were not hunter-gatherers only. They were, somebody was relieved from the hunting and gathering to paint on the walls of these caves, because they're huge murals, and they cover ceilings and walls, and they're masterfully done. And no one puts together an ensemble like this with the distribution of light and dark and composition and flow and movement if they don't know something very, very profound about drawing. And that is really, it dazzled me. Essentially, this little figure, this little guy who's been obviously mowed down by that beautifully drawn bison. I guess he's been mowed down in the field. He almost like a caricature. I mean, the bottom picture looks like he died with a heart on there. Look at that little thing there. He's in full erection at the moment of death. But at any rate, the mastery of the drawing is so evident and the sort of worship, I guess, of some kind. There must have a spiritual value in the animals, the way they're drawn. But you look at the way their legs are tapered and the shadowing and the light and the dark, and you're beginning to see calligraphic content emerge. By the time you got to the Dogon cave paintings in Mali, you're beginning to see pictographs. You could take the legs, and so the legs represent movement, and then you could abstract from that, and one thing leading to another, and you have pictographs. And then you go on into history, and 1500 BC, we have this remarkable, I've just always been dazzled by these things, the Nazca in Peruvian plain. It's a kind of a crusty earth, and you can scratch into it, and since there's no wind or rain there, these things stay forever. So you have, over 2,000 years ago, they drew this 500-foot long hummingbird on the floor of this desert area. And clearly there was some kind of appeal to the heavens. There's always these space visitors, mythologies and so forth. But these giant monkeys, here you can see the scale of them. There's a scale reference at the bottom there. And you can see that hummingbird is about 400 or 500 feet long, and the monkey is about 100 feet wide. So you really are seeing that these people really put a lot of investment in the act of drawing. There's something about the calligraphic content, the symbolism that meant a lot. Well, as this whole thing evolves, you go into the whole formation of language and calligraphy, getting into pictographs and then cuneiforms and hieroglyphics and then eventually phonetics. It's a staggeringly interesting thing. I've always been fascinated. I love Chomsky and his theories, and I've always been fascinated by it, just as not only because I like to draw, but also just how these ideas evolved and how important they are. I guess India has the oldest language of all. I think it even precedes China, but it really are these remarkable breakthroughs. And clearly we wouldn't be here tonight if somebody hadn't scratched on the wall of a cave and translated from pictograph to phonetics at some point, we wouldn't be communicating. So it's profoundly important. Of course, in Egypt, they had tiers of language. There was the high language, which was far more abstract. It was spoken by the pharaoh's family and the priests and the scientists and so forth. And then they had a street language, which was, pretty much pictographic. It was pretty much just showing what it was. It's always interesting to me in the graphic representation of different languages. Sumerian, you have the ox, the star, the water, the man, and how the similarities remain. For example, in Sumerian, you can still see the ox has horns. In Chinese, he has some horns, but they're adding to it. Probably there's more complex meanings to the ox. And then finally you get into phonetics and you have just the word, and you have very little length. I guess the X may vaguely remind you of the origin of the horns and so forth. But at any rate, in water the same way. So water can be a river, or water can be reflections. And so these calligraphic things are so incredibly intense. And going through the dynasties of China, it's interesting how many ancient words in Chinese are still more or less the same after 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years. They remain pretty much, there are some of them that are almost identical to the way they've always been. So that evolution, that process has been just incredible to me. I've had calligraphers explain all the thick and thin and how you can, in Arabic you can write a word and just literally you can say I hate you or I love you with almost the same gesture, just depending where the fluidity of the line goes and how wide and thick and so forth. So this symbolic content, this communicative content is always there. And interestingly, in China, in Japan, it actually translated not only from the written, but it also went right over the same calligraphic content, went over into painting landscapes and vegetation and so forth. So there was a consistency. And then, of course, the ability to really be a master calligrapher. It's almost like a ballet in the way if you really watch them work, because it's not only the gesture and the speed. It's almost, again, Jackson Pollock brought in the gesture as part of painting. You were in action. So the action of the calligrapher is as important as the product, with all the ragged edges and how it evolves and so forth. And so that you can just see that how important this has all become: calligraphy, signification, vision, ideas, signs, symbol, and language. And the reason I'm talking about it is, as I say, I'm a computer enthusiast, but I think that something very, very profound is being lost if you don't do these rough sketches which are born in an instant, in the heat of inspiration, express the idea of their author in a few strokes, while too much effort and diligence sometimes sops the vitality and powers of those who never know when to leave off. And that's from Vasari, in the 15th century. So you have people who recognize the value of calligraphy and the value of the sketch and the underpinnings, which I'm going to get on to in a minute. Now, you look at an artist like Da Vinci, it's just amazing that he draws as well as he does. He can draw anything, of course, beautifully. But if you want to get into the underpinnings and what's really kind of important, what makes it good, is as you enlarge it, you really see that underlying quality and that underlying calligraphy. Then this is very, very parallel. You can certainly see how drawing this way, you could easily abstract from that, and you can start forming written language. So that interface that is often said that Leonardo drew so well because he knew about things, it is true to say that he knew about things because he drew so well. And I try to, communicate this to students a lot because it really is an important element. I mean, just watching Da Vinci make comparisons between the unfolding growth of a plant or the flooding of a city, he noticed parallels in movement, in action, in graphic quality, and so forth. Rembrandt as well. I mean, these are just absolutely masterful selections, on form and space and everything, drawing on both sides of the line, not just what you're enclosing. The shape you're making on the outside is as important as the shape you're making on the inside. And I have a very hard time explaining that to young people, again, because they're so conditioned to letting the digital world make the decisions for them. So they really don't, it's hard to explain why this is what it is. Why is this so good? Or why, Van Gogh and Chinese writing and Rembrandt, what is the connection? They're obviously not, just pumping out something where certain decisions have been technologically made for them. They're creating those decisions spontaneously on their own. So it's a vast, vast difference. Well, let's get to the 20th century because I think it's been one of the most interesting times, the age of industry, technology, and so forth. And certainly one of the geniuses of the 20th century is Picasso. And I think the mastery of Picasso is primarily drawing. I don't think he was ever considered a great colorist or, as an impressionist or Matisse was considered a colorist. But everything he constructed, everything he developed came out of the underpinnings of his ability to draw. So he would make these connections between, the kind of structure used in a Cezanne painting and an African mask, and he's in the machine age, and you're making these connections, and you can see how this kind of thing happened. It's interesting. This is considered by most curators, the most influential painting of the 20th century, and it's not even that resolved a painting. It isn't that it's a perfect painting in some kind of academic way, but you can certainly see him struggling with opposing that entire Renaissance idea that, you have the background and the foreground, and the person sitting in the foreground had their portrait painting, and they're surrounded by artifacts, and you look in deep space and so forth. So the idea of turning Renaissance space inside out and making the foreground the background, the background the foreground, became a real revolution. And you could see his influence still holding on to the characteristics in African art. At that time, African art was something sailors brought back from their voyages, and they weren't considered valuable at all. They were considered something by primitives, Well, the artists began to look at this stuff. Not only is it not primitive, it's incredibly sophisticated. And it was, you only go to the Metropolitan Museum and see the vast levels of sophistication that came out of Africa. And so you realize that had a tremendous influence. So you don't get to Majoli, you don't get to the beginning of abstract art in the easy route. You have to draw very, very well. And Picasso was just amazing. Everything he did was just turned to gold. And unfortunately, he had for many years a tremendously overpowering, omnipotent influence on everyone. There was that exhibition at the Whitney Museum a few years ago, the influence of Picasso. You could just see how all of American art in the 30s and 20s and 30s just couldn't get out from under him. Every time they would think of something, he'd already thought of it and done it better. And he was a master. Look at this little sketch of Don Quixote. I mean, he got everything. He probably did it in 10 seconds. You got Sancho Panza on the mule and Don Quixote and the spear and the sun and the windmills in the background. And it's absolutely abbreviated calligraphy. Then he gets more passionate in this Weeping Women from the Guernica. But as you can see, the calligraphy, as it builds up, it's in itself the art. Again, you cannot do this digitally. There's no way to get that to that level of energy and that kind of dynamic. I always love this one because it's just a masterful experience in drawing. He takes a fairly realistic drawing of a bull on a litho stone and then starts just changing and changing and changing. Each stage he printed it over and over again, and he finally gets it very abstracted, then he finally gets back to the essence. And that's what we're looking for. That's what I'm trying to explain to students. You've got to be able to do something like that or you're not an artist. I like these quotes from Picasso. To draw, you must close your eyes and sing. I draw like other people bite their nails. I agree with that. If they took away my paints, I'd use pastels. If they took away my pastels, I'd use crayons. If they took away my crayons, I'd use pencils. If they stripped me naked and threw me in prison, I'd spit on my finger and draw on the walls. And I think that's kind of how you have to feel about it. So let's talk a little bit about calligraphic content, signification, abstraction, tonal choices. The one thing I always explain, this is neither an anti-computer diatribe, nor is it a tutorial in technique. I'm not talking about either one. We're only talking about mind and hand and thinking. And all good and genuine draftsmen draw according to the pictures described in their minds, not according to nature. And there's really a lot of truth to that. You can reflect off of nature, you can borrow from nature, but it really comes in this drawing process. Now let's talk a little bit about Picasso. He was this, as I say, this formidable influence, a tremendous weight on everybody's back. No one could dump him. I mean, it's just impossible because he was too good to be true. And you can see the early Jackson Pollock here. He is ahead of Picasso in 1910. By the 1940s, Pollock is still working Picasso off his back. Then finally, he just explodes one day and he becomes Jackson Pollock. And how did he do that? He looked at the Picasso drawing and said, okay, there's one thing left in Picasso that's rooted in those old-fashioned Renaissance tradition. He's using, even though it's an abstract group of forms, he's still using the lines themselves to model. He's modeling form. Well, what if I take those lines and blow them up to monumental scale so they no longer model form in that traditional way? And that was his breakthrough, and then action painting started, and of course Jackson Pollock became Jackson Pollock. So all of that revelation, all of that process was drawing. Another artist incredibly influenced by Picasso, Picasso was also a great sculptor, so Giacometti had a hard time unloading the sculpture part of Picasso. And then, I guess one day he woke up and he started whittling away at a piece that was volumetric, and it got smaller and smaller. In fact, he admitted that. He just got smaller and smaller. And then what he did is he seized that moment just before it disintegrated. And then you realize that he began working with the vortex of space. Not like that little Henry Moore head, and it's all filling up space. He was working with the center of space. And he reflected that in his drawings, and that's how he drew. So what I'm really trying to always explain to students is that if you have an idea, your drawings and your techniques and your way of doing, everything about it will reflect the idea, and that will embrace and enhance that idea. So Giacometti drew exactly the way he made sculpture, as the vortex of space. Jasper Johns, when you think of Old Glory, it's Old Glory waving in the wind, and Gilles de Hassem, when he painted the flags, they're always waving in the wind and everything. Jasper Johns woke up one morning and said, why does the flag have to be illustrative? Why can't it be an artifact on which things take place? And so suddenly the flag doesn't wave anymore. It's a thick artifact with a caustic paint on the surface, sculptural collage on top of that. So there's actually a sculptural dimension to the painting. The painting is as object. Duchamp, of course, had appointed found objects as art, meaning that you would point an object, put it in a gallery, and it would displace the space. The urinal in the art gallery suddenly makes you realize that all the sculpture around it is something that the urinal is not, and the urinal makes you re-see the space. Well, from that tradition, John said, okay, what I'm going to do is go back through that process, and I'm going to resurrect it as high art again. So he went to the found object, and even when he was drawing, he was trying to explain to you, I think through his drawing, which are marvelously calligraphic, that this thing isn't just flat. This has deep space, forward space. It exists with all the complexities of illusory space, but it's not illusory. So I think that these kinds of dialogues that take place, Cy Twombly, another, marvelous painter, draftsman, I mean, he writes into his work. It's almost as that pivotal moment when calligraphy, as drawing the bison on the wall of the cave, suddenly somebody realized that if you just twisted that around, you can make a word for leg, you can make a word for horn, you could make a word for bison, and so forth. And he's sort of experimenting almost as though the meaning of the word and the graphic technique of the canvas are working simultaneously, very much like that Mali cave I showed you. Well, what I'm really kind of laying out for you here is kind of the dialogue that is lost if we completely depend on the computer. And 20th century architecture had a kind of a different agenda. I showed you before that, Renaissance draftsmen drew, with a great deal of expressive clarity. Really, they were clarifying organic ideas. 20th century fell in love with the machine age, so people began to draw not like Piranesi, which is, in its ways prophetic of Jackson Pollock, actually, in this drawing. But they said, okay, the 20th century is all about hard edges and hard lines and hard forms, and we're going to draw it as we see it. We're not going to draw in that seductive way anymore. The old-fashioned Piranesi is out, and the Chenikov hard edge is in. And of course, that was picked up on by Corbusier and many others to somehow clarify this kind of meaning, this new meaning for architecture, that it was in fact an industrial production. And of course, a lot of it, unfortunately, Corbusier's case, he wanted to replace Paris with this kind of architecture. Fortunately, he was unsuccessful. I kind of like it as it is. There's a lot of architecture like this, but this idea of the huge slab and the great phallic towers, on all sides, but on the other hand, Corbusier was a complex person. He had his Mediterranean side. So, although he's always talking about machines for living in, he always had this kind of warm love of the sun and the soil and the agriculture of the Mediterranean. So he was twisting back and forth. He said himself, "I prefer drawing to talking. Drawing is faster and leaves less room for lies." But when he's drawing the Villa Mayor, you see that he's into that seduction. He's not so much into machines anymore. And but on the other hand, when he parked a car, a Citroën in front of the Villa Stein, he's letting you know that you're not going to understand this building unless you understand the industrial age. This is a working machine. So he bridged a lot of gaps. The Villa Savoy was, I never knew until a few years ago that it was actually a housing project. It was going to be dozens of these Villa Savoys around that landscape, but it only happened once. But it's a little masterpiece of that kind of sculptural interaction, and that's reflected in the drawing. You can see there's a contextual, sculptural thing that goes on, a kind of passion in line that Corbusier feels throughout it, and he certainly reflected that in Round Shop, which I personally consider of the sculpture as architecture buildings probably the greatest one ever done. It's just spectacular. And but the way he was drawing, with this searching line, the trying to figure it out, how it's going to work, how is it going to melt into that landscape, how is it going to rise up. When you get rid of all that Gothic sculpture, the sculpture that used to be applied to the building, and make the building into a sculpture in itself, that requires another kind of drawing process. Well, clearly drawing really made a big pivotal move in the 20th century. The great Tribune Tower competition. Most of these are what I would call renderings. I mean, they're illustrations. They're not what, would be considered really drawing in the Rembrandt or Da Vinci sense of the word, or Piranesi even. I mean, they're really illustrations for a competition, so they're highly illustrative without much other underlying meaning. They're what they are. But the variety of contributions to that competition, or the entries, were just amazing. I mean, I love this Mastoff one from Germany with the American Indian, and Adolf Loos, I think, was pulling our leg a little bit. Interesting enough, Gropius was the only one who had the courage to go all modern. This was at that cusp point when the Beaux-Arts was still prevalent. There was still desirable style. Neo-Gothic was still in, and, modernism had not been accepted. It was that, and you could see it in the drawings. You could see the tension in trying to make this hard-edged industrial new world at the same time. And Saarinen actually put a lot of fuzz. He wanted to fuzz it up. He wanted to make his Gothic, he wanted to be a little Gothic so they wouldn't miss the point. But at the same time, he made it kind of soft and fuzzy. But he didn't win. What really won was, of course, the Raymond Hood Tribune Tower that we know today, and with drawings by Hugh Ferris, who was a great draftsman, of course, at that time. But you can see that the jury just they weren't going to go to they weren't going to go as far as Gropius, that's for sure, in 1922. Anyway, then we know, of course, as things got harder and tougher and more firm, and you had the constructivist revolution, and here's Lenin, carrying the revolution in his arms there. But again, you get the light, the shadow, the energy, the contrast. Here's Chernikov's City of the Future. Again, Chernikov. I mean, you can tell that they're not going to be seduced. They're going to let the Spartan energy of the industrial age dominate their graphic style, because that's what the message they're trying to carry. That was certainly carried forward in Archogram and the plug-in city, the idea that you could have a city in which you have parts and then you just keep plugging in and you plug it in and it expands at an incremental rate. But to render that idea was to be more illustrative. The illustrative content became paramount in Archogram. So you had to, there wasn't a lot of seducing going on here. There was nice color and things, but they were trying to tell you the idea. Another thing about drawing is that if it's really good and thoughtful, it can be prophetic. I mean, look at this drawing from Archogram by Michael Webb in 1958, and Piano and Rogers didn't get to the Centre Pompidou until 1977. It's almost a replica of almost everything that Archogram had already thought of. So these ideas, sometimes when the more official architects get a hold of them, then they become, sort of part of the culture, and they become modified or homogenized into what actually gets built. So drawings can be really prophetic. Venturi, did this house, which I've always admired. It's in a sense trying to break with modernism, but in a sense make commentary on it. So in a way you have these ribbon windows mixed with split pediments and archways, and so there's a lot of mixing and matching of cultural references. So when he drew things, he wanted you to see that very clearly. He wasn't, again, trying to seduce you with drawing. He was going to let you see it very, very clearly. He was also one of that generation that was interested in Warhol and pop art. Now, this is an interesting dialogue, it seems to me, that where the drawing factors in pop art, by the fact that it was reproduced, or that they were abstracting from the process of drawing to have a Warhol, it didn't work as well in architecture. It was interesting because by blowing up comic strips and soup cans to monumental scale, you gave them a scale reference that they didn't have. When you blow up pop culture to monumental scale, Las Vegas has already done it, in a way they've done it for years. So it didn't have the impact of a Lichtenstein where you blow up the Ben-Day dots. So the Ben-Day dots are your substructure there, and you suddenly see the Ben-Day dot as you'd never seen it before. It isn't really the same thing. I found this dialogue, this specific choice of dialogue, probably worked better as painting than it did as architecture, because it didn't quite have the same resonance. I know Michael Graves struggled too with the same issues, and trying to bring in historical references, bring in cross-referencing and so forth. And his drawings were really very rich and evocative. And then somehow when they got built, they weren't as evocative. It was interesting that there was something lost in that process of blowing them up. So again, there was something in the calligraphic content. And he said himself, I have a requirement for myself in making designation of elements. I need to have full language, and I not want that language to be only space. Well, then, of course, and after that came the Revolution of '88. Philip Johnson got excited, so he's on to something new. Broken pediments were yesterday. Michael Gray's 15 minutes are up. So then you suddenly have neo-constructivism, and that was kind of revisitation of a movement that never completely got off the ground because Stalin sort of killed it. He wanted to build sort of fascist empire there, and based on kind of almost like a Mussolini-style architecture, so he didn't have much use for the constructivist revolution. And so what happened is that the influences became very small pockets of energy in the Schroeder house, of course, and, the influence, the typologies, and early Eisenman, of course. I mean, again, they're drawing is all this hardness, but what I've always bothered me now is that students, you say, okay, this is your assignment, you're going to do, I don't know, X kind of a building, and the minute they start with these drawings that look like the house typology, or with the partitions and everything like that. And I said, well, what if this house was not about partitioning? What if it wasn't, what if it was about burying, or what if it was about being round, or why do you always start with the same cliches? So a lot of these drawing devices have really become cliche. I mean, this is interesting, not done with a computer, it's done with letter tone. So it's leading to later work, which then became, in case of Eisenman, more organic, ironically, because I kind of like the rigidity of his kind of more they still-like influence. Then it got organic, and it seemed to lose some of that energy. But certainly the constructivist revolution, has wiped the slate clean, and for the last at least 20 years, I think almost every architect in the world seems in some way influenced by Chernikov and Melnikov and so forth. Certainly, I mean, you would not have a Rem Koolhaas image like this had you not had a Chernikov City of the Future. So the dynamics of possibilities, or Zaha Hadid, so you can really begin to see that these dynamics, and interesting, Zaha used to do what looked like computer drawings by hand, because I do think that underlying her strengths, she wanted to make these complex forms or interactions and somehow render them. By rendering them, she understood them better. And then, of course, she's gone in, like everyone else, we do, computer drawings and so forth. And Lebbeus Woods, who does, in a sense, fantasy architecture, but his work is primarily drawing. But it's, again, illustrative more than it is what I would call dealing with these layers of calligraphy and structure. Gary, on the other hand, is, I think, the kind of the soul of the artist here, because he is, dealing with inside-outside relationships, so his work does become more searching and more ambiguous and more, what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, the quality of the accident. The accident plays a role in the formation of a Gary building. And you can certainly see it in this particular case. Well, anyway, let's get into this vision, idea, sign, symbol, and language, which is, this what I call from hand to mouse. And this is a point at which I find myself now personally, but I think a lot of young people are beginning to say, well, maybe if I did both really well and understood the interface between these two extremes and pulled them together, my work would be, more thoughtful. And I always like this statement about Picasso: computers are useless, they can only give you answers. Well, he kind of overstated the case, because he certainly didn't anticipate Bill Gates and what was going to happen afterwards. But he's to some extent right, and I like the one at the bottom even better. A pencil is quiet, clean, odorless, inexpensive, and lightweight. I can slip it in my pocket and take it with me everywhere. And I always think about that, since I do that all the time. Why do I have this damn heavy computer I have to keep watching like a hawk? And never works half the time anyway. And then, I go to schools or architecture schools, and it looks like this. It's just a sea of technology, and everybody glued to these screens. And the issue about it is now you even have SketchUp and all these formats now that tell you, well, okay, you don't like the hard stuff, you don't want to look too indifferent, we'll give you SketchUp. And so you have this little SketchUp, and these are sketches of mine on the other sides of it. But believe me, when I make a drawing like the one on the right and the one at the bottom, they do not look like SketchUp. They really don't. Here's SketchUp again on the top, and it's one of my sketches on the bottom. They aren't about the same thing, even remotely. I mean, I don't like SketchUp. I'd rather sketch up, if I'm going to do it, because it really is, it's ridiculous. And, I draw like this all the time. I'm constantly drawing like this. And this is where you get to the heart of this whole. One of the main values of hand drawing is a subliminal accident, and the opportunity it offers to develop ideas based on the residuals of chance. And a computer just can't do that. I cover pages with all these things. When I look back through all these files I have on these little piles of sketches, I don't even know what I was doing. I was designing a wedding ring on something on one side, but I don't even know what I was doing at the time. But very often I'll go back through them, and I'll look at them and something will come into my mind. Just seeing that random sketching, I think, oh my God, I thought of something, I didn't even know I thought about it. And again, the difference between how to draw what you see, which is just pure illustration, or computer drawing, the way I do these sketches, I mean, these are just two little sketches. This little fat lady, by the way, I always have this ideal woman. She weighs about 300 pounds. I mean, this is just a personal thing with me, but she keeps popping up in my drawings, and she's always mixed in with trees and bushes, and who knows? I don't know what I was thinking about at all. But even this little beggar I drew, I think it was in Turkey, I mean, just a little watercolor sketch I did of a person who was sitting on the street. I can find, things in this kind of drawing that you would not find if I just sat there in front of my computer kind of digitally working out a plan or an elevation or a section. So I wrote an article for Blueprint magazine about a year ago, which got a lot of feedback, by the way. I've gotten from all over the world, I've gotten feedback. And when electronic drawing mechanisms replace the filtration of idea development through tactile means and guiding fingertips, the fertile territory of subliminal accident is lost. This refers to marginal calligraphy that dribbles off the edge of the paper, an inadvertent congestion of squiggly lines with no apparent meaning, the unwelcome blobs of ink that drop off of a pen tip, or the inclusion of seemingly irrelevant references that have nothing to do with initial intentions. On innumerable occasions over the years, I've been the creative beneficiary of my own graphic meditations and these chaotic trail of ambiguities left behind by charcoal smudges, watercolor washes, and so forth. In other words, random pictorial detritus inscribed on paper without any predetermined architectonic mission has often become the springboard for new ideas. And that is really, to me, the bottom line. And I'll talk a little bit about sight now. I always drew pretty well, even when I was in school. This dorky picture of me, that was back in my college days. But I always drew pretty well. And actually, if there are any young people in the audience, this is the ultimate pickup technique is to, and when I was younger and probably more vigorous, pre-Viagra, obviously, a very pretty girl would come and say, would you draw my portrait? And you draw the portrait very beautifully, and in a few days she comes back, oh, would you draw me in the nude? Well, then what you do, you got to be cool about that. You got to say, well, I have a very busy schedule, maybe I could work you in Thursday, But, by the Thursday, you've got this beautiful nude woman lying in front of you because you draw well. So there are benefits, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits. Another thing, I won a Pulitzer Award. They don't have this award anymore, but I illustrated for the National Liturgical Society. I illustrated by very expressionist kind of woodcuts. I did a Bible illustrations, and actually I was 22 years old and I won a Pulitzer. There are all the other people that won that year. But anyway, I had a good start in drawing, and then, pre-sight days I was a sculptor, as you probably know. I did big kind of monumental constructions out of concrete and steel that looked sort of like this. And one of the things that, I was doing pretty well as a sculptor, and I was working for architects. But, one morning I just woke up, and I just said, there's nothing interesting about making form. Anybody can make forms that look good. And I just couldn't see waking up and making shapes and volumes and formalism and all that stuff anymore. I just really, I felt I had to do something else. I think it was Duchamp who said, if you're going to be creative, you have to clean off your desk 3 times in your life. And I agree with that completely. I advise every student, I say, well, you may think you're a hot shot in 5th year thesis or something, but wait till you get out there and really have to test your originality against the world. So I was really getting tired of it. And, our career started with, some very controversial buildings. We took these, big box shopping centers and brought another dimension. They became a subject matter for art, not that they were design projects, they were really a subject matter for art. And they were very controversial at the time, as you probably know. And, it's a reason I was talking tonight a little bit about it, that I've never been invited to Harvard ever in my whole life for a lecture. And I have a feeling, trace it back, that they were so offended by this in the beginning that, that you'll never, it's like Hollywood, you'll never work in this town again. So I'll never be invited to Harvard. But anyways, sight went on. We got into a lot of things, public spaces, parks, gardens, integration of art and architecture. Lots of them were art projects, children's parks, expositions, just a whole variety of things. I'm just going to talk about a few things tonight. Really, my process, my own process, which is this rough sketch, just the fluid thinking. Then, you do renderings to sort of explain it to the client. And then there's the aesthetic experience. And One thing we've always done, at least I've always thought about, is, the context. It's wherever it is, there's something outside of it or inside, outside, or simultaneous events. And so the calligraphy of my drawings has always been about this interface between inside and outside and back and forth. And I develop a kind of language for myself. And this is what I've been telling students. I said, yeah, I can teach you how to do wash drawings or draw like I do, but that won't do you any good if you have another kind of idea. If you have a different idea, then you're like the Giacometti drawings. Your drawings, if you're going to draw the vortex of space, it's got to look like that. If you're going to draw integrated systems, which is what I'm interested in, you could draw like this. You draw in a calligraphic way to say that. I mean, here's a competition we won about a year and a half ago in China for New World Plaza, but it was all based on the vascular system, and the idea was that the whole plaza would be a vascular system, then rise up like a body almost and cover the shopping center underneath. And there's a drawing that seems, now this is what I would call an illustrative drawing. Fundamentally, the purpose was just to draw it like it would sort of look. It still has calligraphic quality, but when you look to the underpinnings, you see it's like a fingerprint. All that stuff that you don't recognize, if you blow it up, you begin to see that deep structure. You really see those underpinnings, which again, you can't do with a computer. They're like your fingerprint. They're the fingerprint which then leads to the idea. And as I say, I read a lot about language, and I like this by Chomsky. The syntactic component of grammar must be specified for each sentence, a deep structure that determines its semantic interpretation and a surface structure that determines its phonetic interpretation. Language is a process of free creation. Its laws and principles are fixed, but the manner in which the principles of generation are used is free and infinitely varied. Even the interpretation and use of words involves a process of free creation. And drawing is the same. In generative language, grammar of language, deep structure refers to the underlying meaning, while surface structure applies to the observable arrangement of words through which ideas are communicated. A similar situation exists in hand drawing. There is the obvious illustrative subject, meaning the surface representation, in concert with the underlying calligraphic content, which can unlock multiple meanings and greater freedom of expression. And that's kind of a summary of what I'm into tonight. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about calligraphic content, this idea of the fingerprint. Interesting enough, you take a fingerprint and you blow it up digitally, it becomes controlled by the digital process. Something is lost. Now, if an artist is really perceptive, like a Chuck Close says, oh, I'm going to blow those dots up and then paint them back individually. And that's kind of what art is all about. That is the invention of the artist. He's using this iconography, realizing that this digital world has something to say, so he's blowing it up and building another kind of art experience out of that situation. I draw all the time. I'm like Picasso. I draw like people bite their fingernails. And I'm always, thinking of applications and functions. And this is a part I usually give this to students just to kind of get them on the ball. I mean, you can use it for, like here I was, just drawing all kinds of surfacing of building, how are we going to, this is the project in India, how are we going to do the shade and the light and, the solar collecting and all. These are just rough sketches. And sometimes I do kind of hard line drawings, paste them all down, and paste them up as a building. This was an extension of a medieval city in France, and we were building a government center. And you would go really basically to the top of the site, then come down on top of the building to get in it. And again, this is a cultural center in Paris for the history of the Japanese garden. It was really going to be a center about that. And it was on a curve, and so we thought it would be kind of interesting to morph it into the Japan. So it goes from Paris to Japan in a metamorphic process. But you see, I did all this with drawing, just pasted up. So it's both drawing and model simultaneously, I like to do. Then I got a little farther along. I did a watercolor, to sort of get me a sip. Then I get into it more. When I do the watercolor, I'm more into that process. It becomes, in a sense, more abstract, but it also becomes more specific in terms of content. Again, I do a lot of watercolors. This is a waterfront in Windsor, Canada. But again, where I feel it works. Here was the thing now, for example, I had to do it very hard-edged way because nobody would understand it. What had happened, this is South San Francisco, we were building this building, and I wanted to build everything in the building out of the aggregate that came out of the ground because the stone there was such a beautiful color. We thought we'd make it into the aggregate of the building, but then to show where it came from, we would morph the building back into the landscape. So I had to draw that in a finite way, and that's the kind of way I rendered it. So this is drawing as pure illustration to get to the point. This is the same thing. This is a building that's almost finished. It's a business center in Korea, in Seoul, and it's all wood, but I wanted to show that quality of the wood and the layering, and the wood's not just beams, it's very flat panels, so you can see inside and outside of the building at the same time, and so I had to draw it that way. This one was a little more abstract because this was the family that was doing this building, this house, really wanted to live in the forest. So the forest goes through the middle of the building, goes behind the building, we literally melted that building. So I wanted to show that melting process. So the calligraphy, again, if you blow it up, is that melting. So the calligraphy is the melt. So I'm saying, I'm finding, in a way, the way of drawing to say what I want to say. Then I was drawing for humor and commentary, and this was a project we did for the Biennale. When I travel, I do lots of travel sketches very quickly in books. This was a Earth Day poster, just the greening of New York. But again, you can see that, I had fun doing it. It was a kind of humorous commentary on New York. And, again, I could play around with watercolor and have some fun. This was another fun project for Blueprint magazine. They said, well, how would cities develop after, global warming and everything's underwater? And this is my development of New York on top of the water. You just build on top of the existing underwater skyscrapers. This was a Biennale project we were doing called the Ville Radieux, was a commentary on Le Corbusier, but it was a big, huge cargo net filled with black oil-soaked mannequins. All that to say, there were black people really hanging from this crane over a whole puddle of oil, and so it was kind of the Ville Radieux. The oil has consumed us, not we the oil. And then the other project was for an urban garden and a vaporetto. And these are, again, very highly illustrative. These, you're setting them off to get to the point. Now, on the other hand, if I want to do, I'm thinking about, I illustrated Candide once years ago, but I think of doing a revised version of it. And these are, again, much more what I would say, they're getting in more abstract, more into the calligraphy, more into the abstraction from that. One thing I will, and I do explain this to students a lot, I said, look, if you really draw well, you get on magazine covers and they make the poster, they make the key poster with your drawings. And that's happened to us a lot over the years. I would say maybe 50 or so magazines have used our work on the cover because it's a hand drawing. Everything from Art Forum to ecological magazines to Russian design magazine, landscape, architecture. So we've had many, many, many chances at being on the cover simply because the drawings are there. Then there's the personal level. My wife is always mean to me. So, I did this, I think, for her birthday one year, and she was nice to me for at least 2 weeks afterwards. I mean, you make your wife into a garden, and then she loves you again. On the other hand, I have troubles because she's very cruel, and she always tells me, well, why don't you look like you did in your sculpture days? I was really muscular, wrenching all that iron. And I keep trying to tell her, I look much better now. I'm much better now. And she says, oh, no, I like the one. And she even does cruel things like hang pictures of me in Speedos on the refrigerator. And I say, no, no self-respecting modern woman wants that old-fashioned type. They want me now. And so I did a demonstrative drawing to show her that she doesn't want that old-fashioned type. She likes the one on the right because it's sleeker, it floats, so. Anyway, okay, back to Seit's work. Drawing can be used for many things. This is the Ghost parking lot, a very early project where we asphalted over a parking lot full of cars. But this is part of the early revolt against private art and object art and, plop art and so forth. And, I wrote 2 articles. One was called Plop Art, and the other was The Turd in the Plaza, which really, I really don't favor this kind of art just because it's private art put outside. That's all it is. There's no effort to integrate. And I always felt that public art interpreted as the environment rather than it viewed from the traditional perspective of an object sitting in the environment. So that's how the ghost parking lot grew up. But you see the drawing is matching the concept. It goes along with the conceptual thing. And this is another early project. I'm just going to show you a few things that were, had a meaning behind them and how the drawings evolved. This is the high-rise at home, a very early project, kind of rebellion against the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and Corbusier and mass housing and this kind of thing, the loss of identity. And the idea was you'd make a high-rise where it would be like Duchamp's idea of can chance. You make the can, you make the matrix, and then you see what happens. You wait and see how people will fill it in spontaneously. Corbusier himself had done sort of that idea for the viaduct housing, but as you can see, he's going to design every house. It's not like this is collage and this is, modern design. So he was going to actually control the destiny of the houses. I always like these collage things. I always like what people do spontaneously. And so all the sketches were about how that would happen in an organic fashion. I was looking at all kinds of Sears catalog buildings, the good old days, where you could order up any iconography, any kind of doorway, windows. We made a system for ordering, so you could have a catalog, and you could just order up anything you wanted. And we worked it out in terms of urban design and what it would be like in the city. You'd certainly notice a building like this if it popped up in Boston, that's for sure. Probably this would be banned in Boston. If I was banned for the best building, you can imagine if this happened, Harvard would never, ever speak to me. I would be, oh God, the mere mention of my name. Anyway, we got into this notion of architecture as idea, attitude, and contents versus architecture as form, space, and structure. Now, obviously, it's like Duchamp said, well, I'm non-retinal. That didn't mean you don't see his work. It just meant he didn't want to be retinal, as like Impressionist paintings were retinal, or Cubist paintings were retinal. He didn't want to be tactile. So when we say that, we're really about other things than merely form, space, and structure. And I'll just show you a few projects that are, you recognize they're pretty famous projects. But anyway, this is the idea of cutting through and finding inside and outside simultaneously by just an incision process. And it went from the real bicycles inside to the castings. Actually, a sculptor did all this casting on the outside. It's a masterpiece of casting. But they went from this inside out. So I had to do the color thing. In the little watercolor, I had to show that the inside things are real, and they go into the surreal outside. As they go through the thermal barrier, they go into another ghost world. So they become duality. Here you can see the little fire engine going through, and you have that duality of inside, outside simultaneously working. It was very funny. A lot of adults really just couldn't understand what this building was about, but kids loved it. I mean, the kids really understood it instantly. But even the sketches I did for it were, part of trying to understand the process. For example, the Pompidou Center, in a sense, is a very, very formalistic idea that you're going to show the duct system and you're going to show the structural system. But again, it was a very precise and very contrived way of doing it. We did it almost the opposite. We just cut through and you see what you find, kind of thing. So it's a very different kind of conceptual thinking. And, I wanted the drawings to somehow reflect that process, reflect that attitude. Okay, well, anyway, this response to context, I said, was going beyond the elements that actually exist in favor of thoughts about things whose existence is implied. Psychology of situation, taking advantage of subliminal references that the audience brings to the place. Rather just kind of things that an audience would not even think about. We were, again, doing the very early buildings. The idea was that people never think about big box stores. That's the last thing. So you put art where people least expect to find it. And that was kind of an interesting thing. Then cultural references, using established signs, symbols, ideas drawn from the larger context. So we did we started, our early green buildings were really basically part of that early shopping center setting, putting a building that was in a forest, putting the forest right through the building. So the context and the situation, the way it was drawn, all matched this idea. They were trying to pull together. The building was on a hillside, so as it went into the earth, we were able to show, geology of the area. I've always been tired of gardens that are just on top. Why are gardens just something you plant and see the surface? Why can't you see the geological structure of the garden? So you could get simultaneous events. Then I got really fascinated with that idea, and I drew these fanatic little drawings of the terrariums and what they would look like and everything. So a lot of that art process, went into something like this as well. So just to conclude here, this is a building that you certainly, if you've been reading the news, is very controversial. Thank God we didn't do it, really, in a way, because our name would be mud, but well, not really, because we had a completely different idea. This Ambani Tower in India, we did the first project for it, and I'll talk about a little bit about the press and things later, but I wanted to get into this idea that the way we work in our office is a continuous interface between inside and outside and the computer. We always do a lot of research. In this case, we were really looking into the structure of the Hindu temple, the layering, the idea that really in this tradition of architecture, you're really building toward enlightenment all the time. In fact, they have diagrams that show not only how nature relates to that process, but they also how the spine relates. So you're really, the spine is a long downward extension of the subconscious. And so you're really, as you move up the spine through the body, you come to the head, the enlightenment on the head. So we really worked with that idea. I mean, I made sketches that were working with that idea. This is supposed to be public gardens, and then the Ambani family would live in a house that was on the top level, where the cranium is, or the enlightenment, I guess. But anyway, we had a pretty bad relationship, but you probably know the story, but we really got kind of screwed on this one. But at any rate, the idea was earth, water, fire, air, light, sound, that as you went up the building, you would have these, and this was, they say, a public garden, and where people could, a vertical garden. Instead of having a park that's like Central Park that spreads out, you would have a Central Park that's vertical. Anyway, there were some innovations. My engineer was quite proud of me on this one, because I thought, well, what's the best way to do this is build a very strong core, then build a truss at the top, let the cables come down, and then build all the floors on the ground level, and then just hoist them into position and lock them in. So it's a much cheaper way of building, much more, and you can control everything. If you're building in the air, of course, with all the cranes and everything you need, becomes a more expensive process. So this was a kind of a structural innovation, but again, it was reflected in the drawings. You can see it was sort of reflected in the drawing. Then I do a lot of these things drawing with paper, so I'm trying to get the layering and get the connection to the Hindu traditions and so forth. And again, you see how this thing evolves in drawings, and bit by bit it's growing, and then it gets a little more decisive, or sorry, which way it's going. But again, there's a calligraphic underpinnings as we're going along, and again, down into color. And then I wanted to set the mood. If you've ever been to Mumbai, it's a sea of pollution. The funny thing is that you're supposed to be able to see the city from this tower, but it's so polluted all the time. If you look out in a vista from Kumbala Hill there, you don't see anything except pollution. So I did a little drawing that sort of was in the murk there. But a lot of what we do is, people feed me, hard line sketches, hidden drawings and hidden line sketches. And I go back, and we go back and forth. Then we'll do, this is the house, the Ambani house that was supposed to be at the top level. And then, they got back into the computer. But I was thinking always, when you do a computer, this is just sections of this blown up digitally, you lose the fingerprint. The fingerprint is not there. So my first drawings of it were that. And so you can see how this interface goes back and forth. And they inform each other. Well, anyway, again, these are just drawing the different decks. You can see how they started as very rough sketches, very calligraphic, and then became refined. Mukesh Ambani's wife likes horticulture, so she had a whole horticultural section where you would see the plants of India in one place, and then there was going to be the water level where there was going to be swimming and water sports and I don't know, whatever. I guess hydroponics were going to be there and a lot of things like that. Then you got, again, as you worked your way up, you could see what was happening. Then our final boards, one thing we always do, which a lot of architects don't do, is put a lot of the drawing process on the final boards. These are very large, 6-foot-high boards, but you could see the evolution of the drawings on the board, the evolution of the process. Well, anyway, I guess you've heard that there has been a version of this built, which is a single-family home, $1 billion family home. But the problem was that I guess the Ambanis handed the architects our project book. And so all of the quotations in the press come directly out of our project, all the descriptions, word for word. And then we get getting our original concept printed next to this thing. And so I hope nobody thinks that we did it or had anything to do with it. So it's created incredible confusion. Anyway, just to conclude this, I don't think SketchUp's ever going to work for me, and I don't know how it works for other people, but it's ironic that computers feel they have to kind of do mock hand drawings, because again, as long as you get to those digital underpinnings, you never have that deep structure. You're never really going to have this kind of calligraphic quality, which is, to me, really the essence of the whole idea. And I like this quote. It's great. We all have at least 100,000 bad drawings inside of us. The sooner we get them out and onto paper, the sooner we get to the good ones buried deep within. I read this to students a lot, and I think it makes them think a little. Anyway, you know, I'm certainly not anti-computer. We use it all the time. It's a great tool, but I don't think it should be the only way. I think there is the fingerprint level. I think there is the substructure. I think there is deep structure, which you have to find. I think there's stylistic choices, media choices, that then, in fact, reflect your real idea, the idea that you're trying to express. I know when we work with clients, we were talking about it a little before the lecture, they really appreciate it. We're talking to a client, I'll be sitting there sketching as we're talking, and then they'll be saying something about an idea they have, so I'll sketch it out. But as you're doing that, you're giving the client ownership of the project. You're getting them involved. They become part of your team. And that teamwork thing, whereas if I'm sitting with a computer in their face, that's not the same thing. There is an alienation factor as soon as you pop open the laptop and is facing the client. So there's a lot of value, really, in this whole thing. And I like this quote from Tintoretto: you can never do too much drawing. Okay, thank you very much. Sure, if anybody wants to, if anybody wants to ask a question.
Microphones in the front, if you'd like to come up so everyone can hear.
I don't know if anybody. Was it lucidly clear? I don't know. I was trying to be unclear.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now that you've been introduced by a art person, is that opening up an opportunity?
I don't know. She's suspicious of me. I could tell. Her body language when she met me, I knew, I got to do this thing. I don't know. No, I don't have darken the doors of Harvard. They don't want to hear this kind of message, but no, it is interesting. Having taught in academia all these years, I knew how these little pockets of defense get started. You get a group of professors who were teaching the student their way, and God forbid, somebody come in and present a different point of view. I have a really extraordinary lecture on radical architecture. I was very involved with the Italian radical architecture people, and I have, lots of subjects, economy of means, all kinds of things that students anywhere, they're not, I try to, not make them too controversial. I know Harvard wouldn't like that, but it's sad in a way that, the diversity of ideas are not welcome, that they're not, we don't have more interchange. I know even in my own school, there's these little camps, and they're all in their little camps, and it just makes no sense because, Chuck Close is a friend of mine, and I remember he said one time, he said, the last thing in the world that I want to, and he's a good art collector, he has a nice art collection, he said, the last thing I want to see on another artist is somebody who's imitating me, who's doing something like me. It makes me feel very nervous, and I feel exactly the same way. When you go to schools, you go to things, you're not selling a bill of goods. You don't expect, God forbid, they copy you, then they just become robots. The thing that I really appreciate, and in fact, my first introduction to Arthur Drexler, who was a really, a Miesian scholar, and, really loved Mies van der Rohe. And our first meeting, I remember he had been told by Emilio Ambach, you got to go see Scythe, they're really interesting, and he said, he saw our work, he said, I want to go down there, that's that's not my kind of art and all that kind of thing. So he finally begrudgingly called me on the phone, and he said, James Wines? I said, yes. He says, I'm coming down because Emilio Ambos said I have to see what you're doing, so I'm coming down for 1 hour. Well, in the first hour, all we did is talk about Mies van der Rohe, and then he realized that I'm a bit of a scholar in Mies van der Rohe, and I really love his work. And then he says, well, how can you love his work and do what you do? And I said, because I don't want to do what Mies van der Rohe did. I love his work. I love a lot of people's work, but I don't want to do what they do. And then we started talking, and he stayed 3 days. He came for an hour, and he stayed 3 days. And we had a great conversation, and the MoMA has a good collection of our work and everything. So I think that, that kind of communication does help. I mean, you think you hate it because you either don't understand the image or whatever. I remember I was on a marvelous panel. Actually, it was the whole point of the panel, I was the only architectural person on it, was careers that had started on negative criticism, really negative criticism. And Roy Lichtenstein was on it because I remember when I first got out of school and his first show was written about in the New York Times. The headline of the article about Lichtenstein was, "Is this the worst artist in the world?" And who wouldn't go to a show like that? That's just the critic talking. So Roy Lichtenstein was there, and Klaus Oldenburg, because he was doing soft sculpture, and at that time, Frank Stella was doing his black paintings, and I was doing the best buildings, I guess, the early best buildings. So, anyway, we're all there kind of defending, ourselves. And the moderator was really good. He said the first clue to the, creatively challenge is, when they look at what you're doing, say, oh, well, that's just a one-liner, or that's not real art, as if they're somehow endowed with powers to know what real art is. Or the third one is it'll never last. These are the three things. So I always tell students, if you hear any of these three things from a teacher, you should just keep doing what you're doing. Really should, because you're on to something. But anyway, one thing Klaus Oldenburg said that always stuck with me, Noguchi was in the audience, very classic academic sculptor, and he was really mad. He just hated Oldenburg's work, and he kept yelling for the audience, your work isn't art, it isn't sculpture. And Oldenburg says, well, why isn't it sculpture? It's sculpture. He says, because it's soft, and real sculpture is hard and firm, and he talked about bronze and stone, but Oldenburg says, look, I like to take some risks. He said, what are the risks? I don't see any risk. And Oldenburg looks out at him and he says, my risk is that you won't understand it. And that way I thought hit home very, very well. That's to the point. And, academia is full of this problem, to say the least. They don't get it, and so they hate it, So, anyway, any other question? I'm sorry it's such a long answer to it, but a good question. It's a very good question, because it comes up a lot. Yeah.
Your drawings are primarily perspective drawings. Where does plan section fit in your study?
Well, I do it almost always simultaneously. I didn't show a lot. I wanted to kind of condense this tonight, just use things that would, basically what I was talking about tonight is that the language you choose, in a sense, is a direct reflection of what you're trying to say. But I do a lot of, I do everything that every architect does. You do sections and plans and drawings, and I do a lot. I could have a whole other lecture just on plans, I guess, things we've done that relate to that. It's just that I chose this thing tonight because I wanted to talk about the surface structure, substructure. That these two things are going on simultaneously. That, again, it comes out of, being involved with academia, is that you kind of trying to make a point understood, and so much of what they're taught is these systems of doing things, of how you get to the result. And I would say, well, you're never going to get to a really interesting result unless you think of it differently, unless you develop some original way. And one of the ways to do it is to pick a media, to take your hand and start thinking about it. And as you're thinking about it, your drawing process will help you evolve. And sometimes it does come completely from the plan. I have, projects that have evolved totally from the planning strategy because of the constraints or whatever the situation. Now, I didn't mean to leave it out. I was talking covering a lot of territory tonight, so I wanted to see if I could compress it to an hour or so. I almost succeeded. But anyway, I know what you're saying, and I agree completely. It's very important. Okay, any other questions? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's a difference
in the way that people visualize a space, depending on whether they learn to draw by hand or whether their first drawing experience was in computer?
I think so. I mean, my experience, again, this may be a generational thing because, you know, I came into the world as computers were developing, so I came to it late. I would say I find that there are people who really can conceive of space well, or form, or anything, or basically ideas, tend to think of better ideas if they're not constrained by that. I have a woman in my thesis group now that is extremely talented and everything, but she's, you know, diehard computer person, so she's trying to make this link between cinema and architecture and everything. And I said, come on, just sketch out everything you can think of that relates to these two fields and where they cross over. I said, you sit there methodically doing a design and, oh, well, that does no good, then do another one. And so she's cubistically working out something that I don't think she'll ever arrive at, really, if she's doing it this way. So I'm trying to get her off the computer. I said, I'm going to take away your computer for a week and just see if you can get to the point here, and then I'll give it back to you. But I do think it helps a lot. I mean, again, I think this hand-to-mouse thing I was talking about is the answer. I think you've got to be able to do both. Feed one feeds the other. Because, you know, you all sit there in front of the computer, you twist it around and work it out, and you're making decisions while you're doing that, but that's a little bit different than the generative creative process. Really, I think it's quite different. Hey, any other? Yes, hi.
How do you integrate drawing into your teaching? I assume you're teaching design.
Yes.
Do you make an assignment out of it, or how do you?
Well, I'm at the graduate level, so, you know, one assumes they've had all this before they get there, but then I find out they don't. And so there is a little bit of therapeutic work I'm forced to do. I'm doing it right now. I got 8 or 10 people I'm doing a lot of therapy with because they just have never learned. They just don't really have any, I mean, it's very crude. And it does look like it came out of those awful how to draw books that I was talking about in the beginning. Where the way they draw is that, you know, that awkward, what they're doing is having more of a struggle getting the drawing art than the ability to think. And it has to be fluid enough so you can think, or you can't really use it very well. It isn't going to be very useful. So I work with them a lot, and I notice that they collect my drawings. I sit there and draw, and then they all have these little collections of these drawings that I've done. And but I find that gradually, you know, they say, well, you know, he did that in 3 minutes. You know, maybe it took me 2 hours to set it up on my computer. Maybe I'll try the 3-minute version, see if that works. So it's just a process. It's very, very difficult to get through. The most difficult is kind of what I talked about tonight. Have them really understand that underlying this illustrative purpose, which is there, certainly in architecture, there is something else going on. And that something else is really, I guess it makes it art, really. It makes it something else. And that's the hardest thing I have to communicate. I have hard to get that one through. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
I have a question that's more of an answer to your question. Twice you said about SketchUp that you don't understand what the lure is. And I'm an illustrator for architecture and I use SketchUp extensively. And to me, I think you've answered your own question. What you're doing, the way you examine your ideas is going to have a direct input on how your ideas become proven.
Yeah.
So if you have something that, great, if you could all draw like you, it would be fantastic. But if you have something that is a computer program that is like drawing on a napkin,
Yeah.
where you can then pull it in and push it, then isn't that exploring more a sectional space, which is where we live, rather than a plan, which is where we design? Like your students who design starting with partitions, when we design starting with lines on a plan, when really we should be designing in sections.
Yeah, I agree completely.
And I think that
That's a very good point.
I agree with you, and the problem with sketching is people try to make it a computer program, when really it should be a sculptural program.
Yeah.
That you're exploring 3D space
Yeah.
instead of just drawing lines.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that's the benefit of having a program that
Yeah.
looks like a sketch on a napkin.
Yeah. Well, I think that in a subliminal way, it gives people that impression, but I do think the subliminal accident that I talked about doesn't happen. As soon as you have, in other words, I have these drawers of these things that I look back, I can't even remember what I was trying to do, but very often something will pop out of it all that I don't think accidentally would ever come through SketchUp or computer drawings. Because by the time you get to a tool like a computer, I always find it very analytical. By the time I started working on the computer, I'm pretty analytical. You know, I kind of got the idea already, and now I'm just working it out.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
my comment, if I may continue, is also about the language you were talking about having a sketch which helps you focus on the design.
Yeah.
And if you have a tool that keys into those visual cues to not focus on the drawing and the way it was drawn, but more focus on the design.
Yeah.
Even if it is a mimic, an imitation, isn't it all about focusing more about the design? I agree with you. You don't get those subliminal gestures. You don't get that.
Yeah. Well, again, you know, the bottom line is everybody has their own way of working. I mean, that's really true. I mean, that is certainly amazing things have happened and have come off of people who only work with a computer. So it's just that for some reason, you know, it's always like when something gets brushed aside and then you realize there's a lot more value, and I think the hand drawing thing, mind-to-hand thing, has gotten brushed aside. And I do, apropos of the other question, I do find that they have a much harder time, if they don't know how to draw well, to conceptualize space and conceptualize ideas. Really more about the ideas, more about what makes, you know, what's going to peg this whole thing together. Yeah, we got the space, we got the sections, we got the drawings. I mean, I'm a great lover of Palladio, and I think the way he did so many sections was just, you know, half the art then. I mean, really, you could see why he was doing it. He was letting you not only see the section, but he's also giving you that sense of its depth and dimension and scale and everything at the same time. I mean, in the final analysis, it all goes back to the same thing. It's like with Duchamp saying, well, I don't want to be non-retinal. Well, in the end, everything he did was retinal, but it wasn't retinal quite in the same way as something else was retinal. Is that you know, painterly painting is retinal. So I think probably what I'm saying is that you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to just dismiss, which is what's happened a lot in academia, at least in my school. I mean, they got this very elaborate computer equipment. Actually, a great friend of mine, actually he's become a great friend of mine, became our biggest benefactor, gave us not only a building, but an entire very elaborate computer department, and continues to do so. And so these young people have everything. They have the cutting edge of everything. And you know, so after a while, the whole notion that you can think and draw and conceptualize just kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So I'm just trying to restore balance. That's all I think. There's a balance in there somewhere.